the circuit preacher's announcement rang through the dusty streets of Green River, Wyoming like a Sunday church bell, declaring that a genuine dance social would be held in 3 weeks' time to celebrate the territory's newest school building being completed in this summer of 1878. And Magnolia Thorne felt her stomach drop straight through the floorboards of her father's mercantile, where she stood arranging bolts of calico. She had never learned to dance, not a single step. Her mother had died when Magnolia was only 7 years old, before there had been time for lessons in waltzes or reels, and her father, Marcus Thorne, had been too consumed with grief and running the store to think about such things. The other girls in town had taught each other, giggling in barns and parlors, but Magnolia had always been too shy to ask, too afraid of looking foolish, too busy helping her father keep their business afloat after her mother's passing. Now she was 22 years old, and the thought of being the only woman in Green River who could not dance filled her with a particular kind of dread that settled like lead in her chest. "You will go, will you not?" Her friend, Sarah Daniels, asked, appearing in the doorway with her 2 young daughters in tow. Sarah had married at 17 and seemed to know everything about being a proper woman that Magnolia had somehow missed learning. "I suppose everyone will be expected to attend," Magnolia said carefully, not meeting Sarah's eyes as she smoothed her hands over a bolt of blue cotton. Her fingers trembled slightly, and she pressed them flat to still the motion. "You suppose? Magnolia Thorne, it is the social event of the year. Every eligible man within 50 miles will be there." Sarah's eyes sparkled with matchmaking mischief, and Magnolia felt heat creep up her neck. "That is precisely what concerns me," she admitted quietly. The bell above the shop door jangled again before Sarah could respond, and Magnolia looked up to see Xavier Garrett entering the mercantile. Her breath caught the way it always did when the mountain man came to town for supplies. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the doorframe, and arms thick with muscle from years of trapping beaver and hauling timber in the Wind River Range. His dark hair fell past his collar, sun-streaked and wavy, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite his rugged profession. He moved with a quiet grace that seemed impossible for a man of his size, and his gray eyes were as clear and sharp as mountain spring water. "Morning, Miss Thorne," he said, his deep voice rumbling through the store like distant thunder. He nodded politely to Sarah as well, removing his worn hat. "Madam." "Mr. Garrett," Magnolia managed, willing her voice to sound steady and professional. Xavier came to town perhaps once a month, sometimes less frequently in winter, and each visit left her flustered in a way she could not quite explain. He was perhaps 27 or 28, she guessed, with the weathered look of a man who had spent his entire adult life in the wilderness. "I need to resupply before I head back up the mountain," he said, pulling a carefully written list from his shirt pocket. "Got everything written down here." Magnolia took the paper, her fingers brushing his calloused ones for just a moment. His handwriting was surprisingly neat, each item clearly printed. She had learned over the past 2 years of his visits that Xavier Garrett was far more educated than most people assumed. He read constantly, she had discovered, judging by the books he occasionally purchased along with his coffee, flour, and ammunition. "This will take me perhaps 20 minutes to gather everything," she said, scanning the list. "Would you like to wait, or should I have it ready for you to collect later?" "I will wait, if that is acceptable. Need to speak with the blacksmith as well while I am in town." He moved to lean against the counter, his presence somehow filling the entire store despite the fact that he simply stood quietly. Sarah, never one to miss an opportunity, immediately pounced. "Mr. Garrett, will you be attending the dance social in 3 weeks?" It would be wonderful to see you there. I know you keep to yourself up in those mountains, but surely you must occasionally crave some civilization and company." Xavier's expression remained neutral, but Magnolia saw something flicker in his eyes. Discomfort, perhaps. "I am not much for social gatherings, madam. I come to town for supplies and not much else." "Oh, but you must come," Sarah pressed on, and Magnolia wanted to sink through the floor. "There will be music and refreshments, and it is for a good cause. The children need their school." "I contributed to the building fund," Xavier said mildly. "Sent money down with the trading post operator last month." Magnolia had not known that. She looked at him with surprise, and he met her gaze for just a moment before looking away. Most people in Green River assumed the solitary mountain man cared nothing for the town or its affairs, but clearly they were wrong. "That was very generous," Magnolia said softly. "The children will benefit greatly." He shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the praise. "Children should have schooling. Makes sense to support it." Sarah's daughters had begun to fuss, pulling at their mother's skirts, and with obvious reluctance, Sarah gathered them up. "I must get these two home for their lunch." "But Magnolia, I expect to see you at the dance, and Mr. Garrett, I hope you will reconsider. The town could use more good men like yourself at such events." After she left, silence fell over the mercantile, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the sound of Magnolia moving around the store, gathering Xavier's supplies. She was acutely aware of his presence, of the way he watched her move from shelf to shelf with those steady gray eyes. "You do not wish to attend the dance either," he said after a while. It was not a question. Magnolia froze with a can of coffee in her hands. "What makes you say that? Saw your face when your friend mentioned it. You looked like she had just invited you to your own hanging." Despite herself, Magnolia laughed, a short, surprised sound. "That is rather dramatic, Mr. Garrett, but not inaccurate." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Why do you not want to go?" She set the coffee can down on the counter with more force than necessary. "It is complicated. Most things worth talking about are." Magnolia bit her lip, debating whether to tell him. There was something about Xavier Garrett's quiet, non-judgmental presence that made her want to be honest. He never seemed to expect anything from her. Never looked at her with the pitying expressions some of the other townspeople wore when they remembered she was the girl whose mother had died too young, whose father worked her too hard in the store, who at 22 remained unmarried with no prospects in sight. "I never learned to dance," she said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. "My mother died before she could teach me, and I was always too embarrassed to ask anyone else. Now there is to be this grand social, and everyone will expect me to participate, and I will make a complete fool of myself." Xavier was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That does sound complicated." "You are mocking me," she said, but without heat. "No." His voice was serious. "I am understanding why you feel anxious, but for what it is worth, I doubt anyone would mock you for not knowing. Could you not simply watch rather than dance? In a town this size, where everyone knows everyone. They will notice, Mr. Garrett. They always notice when someone is different or lacking in some way." She began wrapping his supplies in brown paper, keeping her hands busy so she would not have to meet his eyes. "Sarah means well, but she does not understand. She has always known how to do all the proper womanly things. She sews like a dream, she keeps an immaculate house, she can cook anything, and she dances beautifully. I am adequate at sewing, barely competent at cooking, and I spend my days working in a mercantile like a man might. My father never had a son, you see, so I became the help he needed." "Nothing wrong with working in a store," Xavier said firmly. "Nothing wrong with being competent and strong and capable. Perhaps not wrong, but certainly not what most men seek in a wife." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Magnolia felt her cheeks flame red. "Forgive me." That was inappropriate. Was it true? I do not know. Perhaps. I have not exactly had men lining up to court me. She finished wrapping the last of his supplies and began tallying the cost, grateful for the excuse to focus on numbers rather than his penetrating gaze. "Your total comes to $14.30. Xavier pulled out his money and counted out the exact amount, then added an extra dollar. "For the school fund," he said. "That is very kind. I will make certain the committee knows of your contribution." He gathered his supplies, distributing them into the canvas bags he had brought with him. But he did not immediately leave. Instead, he stood there, seeming to wrestle with something internally. Finally, he said, "I do not know how to dance either." Magnolia looked up sharply. "Truly, truly." "Grew up in the mountains with my father after my mother left when I was young. He was a trapper, taught me the trade, and there was never any call for dancing. The closest I have come is watching a few celebrations from a distance." He settled his hat back on his head. "So if it helps at all, you will not be the only one in town who cannot dance, should you choose to attend." Something warm unfurled in Magnolia's chest. "Thank you for telling me that. It does help, actually." He nodded once, then headed for the door. But he paused with his hand on the latch and looked back at her. "For what it is worth, Miss Thorne, any man who cannot appreciate a woman who is capable and hardworking is a fool not worth your time." Then he was gone, the bell jangling in his wake, and Magnolia stood alone in the mercantile with her heart beating faster than she could explain. The 3 weeks until the dance social passed with agonizing slowness. Magnolia found herself thinking far too often about Xavier Garrett's words, about the unexpected kindness in his eyes when he had admitted that he too could not dance. She had never really considered the mountain man as anything more than a customer, albeit one who made her pulse quicken. But now she caught herself watching the trail that led up into the mountains, wondering about his life up there in the wilderness. Her father noticed her distraction. Marcus Thorne was a thin, quiet man who had grown thinner and quieter in the 11 years since his wife's death, but he was not unobservant. One evening as they were closing up the store, he said, "You have been peculiar lately, daughter. Is something troubling you?" "The dance social," Magnolia admitted. "Everyone expects me to attend, but father, I do not know how to dance." Marcus looked stricken. "I should have taught you. Your mother would have wanted you to know. I failed in that regard as I have failed in so many others." "You did not fail," Magnolia said quickly, going to him and taking his weathered hands in hers. "You kept us afloat. You made certain I had food and shelter and education. Those things mattered more than dancing. But now you are a young woman who should be courting and thinking of marriage, and instead you spend your days working in this store because I have been too weak to hire proper help." His voice cracked. "Your mother would be ashamed of me." "Mother would be proud of both of us," Magnolia said firmly. "We survived father. We built a life. That is nothing to be ashamed of." But she could see the guilt in his eyes, the weight of all the things he felt he had failed to give her. It made her heart ache. The night of the dance social arrived with unseasonably warm weather for late September. The new schoolhouse glowed with lamplight, and someone had decorated the exterior with bunting in red, white, and blue. Magnolia wore her best dress, a soft green cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs, and she had spent an hour coaxing her thick auburn hair into an elegant twist. Her father had insisted she attend, had practically pushed her out the door, saying he would mind the store for the evening even though it was already closed. The schoolhouse was packed with people. The furniture had been pushed against the walls to create a dance floor, and a small group of musicians stood in one corner with a fiddle, a guitar, and a harmonica. The air smelled of perfume and pomade, punch and fresh baked cookies. Magnolia immediately felt overwhelmed by the noise and the crowd. Sarah found her within minutes. "You came. Oh, I am so glad. Does that dress not look lovely on you? Come, let me introduce you to some of the men who have traveled in from surrounding areas." "Sarah, I really do not think." But Sarah was already pulling her across the room toward a cluster of unfamiliar faces. The next hour passed in a blur of awkward introductions and even more awkward conversations. Several men asked Magnolia to dance, and each time she had to decline with mounting embarrassment, explaining that she did not know how. Some took it graciously. Others looked at her as if she had sprouted a second head. A woman who cannot dance. One particularly pompous gentleman from Lander said with a laugh, "How extraordinary! What do you do for entertainment, Miss Thorne?" "I read," Magnolia said stiffly, "and I keep the accounts for my father's mercantile." The man's interest visibly waned. Ah, how practical. By the time the musicians struck up the fourth song of the evening, Magnolia had retreated to a corner near the refreshment table, wishing desperately that she could leave without causing her father further disappointment. She watched the other women whirl across the floor in their partners' arms, their faces flushed with happiness and exertion, and felt a loneliness so profound it made her chest ache. Then the door opened, and Xavier Garrett walked in. The crowd seemed to part around him, conversations faltering as people noticed the mountain man's arrival. He had clearly made an effort for the occasion. His clothes were clean, his boots polished, his hair pulled back and tied with a leather cord. He looked wildly uncomfortable, his broad shoulders tense, his expression carefully neutral. His eyes scanned the room as if seeking an escape route, and then they landed on Magnolia. Something in his face softened. He crossed the room directly to her, ignoring the curious stares and whispered comments that followed in his wake. "Miss Thorne," he said, his deep voice barely audible above the music, "you are hiding in the corner." "I am observing," she corrected, but her lips twitched toward a smile despite herself. "What are you doing here? I thought you did not attend social gatherings." "I do not, generally." He glanced around the room with obvious discomfort. "But I thought perhaps you might appreciate some company in your misery." Magnolia laughed, a genuine sound that drew more curious looks from nearby attendees. "That is possibly the most honest thing anyone has said to me all evening. I try to be truthful when possible." He paused, then said, "Would you like to step outside for some air? It is rather stifling in here." She should say no. It would not be proper to step outside alone with a man, especially one she barely knew. But the thought of spending another minute in this crowded room, fielding pitying looks and awkward questions, made her want to scream. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." They slipped out a side door into the cool September night. The stars overhead were brilliant, unfettered by city lights, and the sound of the music faded to a distant, muted melody. Magnolia breathed deeply, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. "Thank you," she said after a moment. I was about ready to walk home and face my father's disappointment. Why would he be disappointed? Because he wanted me to have a lovely evening, to dance and laugh, and perhaps attract the attention of a suitable gentleman. Instead, I spent the entire time explaining why I cannot do the one thing everyone came here to do. She wrapped her arms around herself, though the night was not particularly cold. I should have stayed home. Xavier was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I have a confession to make." "Oh." "I did not come here just to keep you company." "I mean, I did, but I also came because I have been thinking about what you said, about not knowing how to dance, and about how everyone would notice." He turned to face her fully, and even in the dim light spilling from the schoolhouse windows, she could see the earnestness in his expression. "I thought perhaps, if you were willing, I could stand with you on the dance floor. We could move together, even if neither of us knows the proper steps. At least then people would not stare and whisper about you being alone." Magnolia's breath caught. "You would do that. But Xavier, you just said you do not know how to dance either. We would likely look ridiculous." He shrugged, a slight movement of those massive shoulders. "Perhaps. But we would look ridiculous together, which is better than looking lonely alone. And honestly, Miss Thorne, I doubt either of us cares what these people think nearly as much as we pretend to." It was possibly the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, even though he had not meant it romantically at all. At least, she did not think he had. It was simply kindness, she told herself firmly, a gesture from one outsider to another. But when she looked into his gray eyes and saw the warmth there, the genuine desire to help her, she felt something shift in her chest. Something that felt dangerously like the beginning of something she had never expected to feel. "All right," she said softly. "Yes. Let us go back inside and be ridiculous together." His face broke into a smile, the first real smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his entire appearance. For a moment he looked younger, less weathered, almost boyish. "Good," he said, "because I have to admit I am terrified." "That makes two of us." They walked back inside together, and Magnolia was immediately aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Xavier Garrett, the reclusive mountain man, walking side by side with Magnolia Thorne, the spinster shopkeeper's daughter. It was precisely the kind of thing that would fuel Green River's gossip for weeks, but Xavier seemed oblivious to the attention, or perhaps he simply did not care. He led her directly to the edge of the dance floor just as the musicians finished one song and prepared to begin another. The caller announced it would be a waltz, and Magnolia felt panic flutter in her stomach. "Xavier, I truly do not know the steps," she whispered urgently. "Neither do I," he whispered back. "So we will simply move together and try not to step on each other's feet." The music began, a slow and lilting melody. Around them, couples fell into the familiar pattern of the waltz, moving with practiced grace. Xavier took Magnolia's right hand in his left, then gently placed his other hand on her waist. The touch sent a spark of electricity through her entire body. "Ready?" he asked. "No, but let us do it anyway." They began to move. It was, objectively speaking, a disaster. Xavier's steps were uncertain, too large, and he kept glancing down at his feet as if willing them to behave. Magnolia had no idea where to put her feet at all and mostly just followed his lead, stumbling every few steps. They bumped into another couple, apologized profusely, and then bumped into yet another. But somewhere in the midst of the chaos, something wonderful happened. Magnolia began to laugh. It started as a giggle, then grew into full-throated laughter that shook her entire frame. Xavier looked startled for a moment, then began to laugh as well, a deep rumbling sound that matched the timbre of his voice. "We are terrible at this," Magnolia gasped between peals of laughter. "The absolute worst," Xavier agreed, grinning widely. "I think I just stepped on your foot for the third time. Fourth, actually, but who is counting?" They had stopped trying to follow any particular pattern now, and were simply swaying together in rough time with the music, moving in a small circle in their corner of the dance floor. Other couples gave them a wide berth, and Magnolia was distantly aware that people were staring, but she found she did not care even a little bit. Xavier's hand was warm on her waist, his other hand holding hers gently but firmly, and his gray eyes were fixed on her face with an expression she could not quite read. "You are not hiding anymore," he said softly, his voice nearly drowned out by the music. "Neither are you," she replied. They continued to move together, not quite dancing but not quite still either, finding their own rhythm that had nothing to do with the waltz the musicians were playing. Xavier held her close, closer than was probably proper, and Magnolia let herself relax into his strength, into the solid steadiness of his presence. She could feel the muscles in his arms and shoulders, the leashed power in his frame, but his touch remained gentle, careful, as if he were holding something precious. The song ended, and for a moment, they simply stood there, still holding each other while applause rippled through the room. Then Xavier stepped back, releasing her with obvious reluctance. "Thank you," he said, "for being willing to look ridiculous with me." "Thank you for suggesting it," she replied, feeling breathless and giddy and more alive than she had in years. "I think that was possibly the most fun I have ever had at a dance. Considering it is the only time you have ever danced, that is not saying much. True, but I meant it nonetheless." The musicians were taking a brief break, and the crowd had begun to mill around, people heading for the refreshment table or stepping outside for air. Sarah appeared at Magnolia's elbow, her eyes wide with curiosity and barely suppressed excitement. "Well," she said, looking between Magnolia and Xavier with obvious delight, "that was certainly something." "It was something," Magnolia agreed, unable to keep the smile off her face. "Mr. Garrett, I am so pleased you decided to attend after all," Sarah continued, directing her attention to the mountain man. "It is good to see you participating in town activities." Xavier shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable again now that he was the focus of Sarah's attention. "It seemed like a worthy cause, madam." "Indeed. And it appears you and Magnolia have become quite friendly." Sarah's tone was innocently curious, but Magnolia could see the matchmaking wheels turning in her friend's head. "Miss Thorne has been kind to me during my supply runs," Xavier said carefully. "I am simply returning that kindness." Before Sarah could press further, her husband called to her from across the room, something about their youngest daughter and a spilled glass of punch. With obvious reluctance, Sarah excused herself, but not before giving Magnolia a significant look that clearly said they would be discussing this later. "I apologize for her," Magnolia said once Sarah was out of earshot. "She means well, but she can be rather persistent when she thinks she has found a potential match." "Is that what she thinks? That we are a potential match?" Xavier's expression was carefully neutral, but Magnolia thought she detected a hint of something hopeful in his voice. Her heart began to pound. "I do not know what she thinks, but I know that I enjoyed dancing with you, even though neither of us knew what we were doing, and I find myself hoping that perhaps you might visit the mercantile more frequently, even when you do not need supplies." The words hung in the air between them, bold and terrifying. Magnolia could not believe she had said them, could not believe she had been so forward. But Xavier's face had gone soft, his eyes warm, and he stepped closer to her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "I would like that," he said quietly. "In fact, I find myself wishing I did not live quite so far up in the mountains, because the thought of waiting another month before I see you again is rather unbearable." Magnolia's breath hitched. "Xavier, I know I am not the kind of man most women would want," he continued, his voice low and intense. "I live a rough life in rough country. I am more comfortable with silence than conversation, and I have spent so much time alone that I sometimes forget how to be around people. But Magnolia, when I am with you, I do not feel like I am forgetting. I feel like I am remembering something important that I had lost." She reached up without thinking and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and fast beneath her palm. "I am not the kind of woman most men would want either," she whispered. "I work like a hired hand. I barely know how to cook a proper meal, and apparently, I cannot dance to save my life. But when I am with you, I feel like maybe those things do not matter as much as I thought they did." Xavier covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his heart. "They do not matter at all. Not to me." Around them, the party continued, but Magnolia was barely aware of it. Her entire world had narrowed to this man, this moment, the feeling of connection that stretched between them like a physical thing. She had known Xavier Garrett for 2 years, but only in passing, only as a customer and a shopkeeper. Now, in the space of a single evening, everything had changed. The musicians began to play again, another waltz. Xavier glanced toward the dance floor, then back at Magnolia with a slightly sheepish expression. "Would you be willing to make fools of ourselves one more time?" he asked. She laughed. "Absolutely." This time was slightly better. They still did not know the proper steps, still moved in their own improvised pattern that bore only a passing resemblance to an actual waltz, but they moved with more confidence, more certainty. Xavier held her close, his hand spanning her waist, and Magnolia let herself sink into the warmth of his embrace. She could feel the curious stares of the other attendees, but they felt distant, unimportant. "Tell me about your life in the mountains," she said as they swayed together. "What is it like up there?" Xavier considered this for a moment. "Quiet," he said finally. "Beautiful. Sometimes dangerous. I have a cabin about 15 miles from here, up near the tree line. In the winter, the snow can pile up to the roof, and I do not see another human soul for months. In the summer, the meadows are full of wildflowers, and the creeks run cold and clear with snowmelt. I trap beaver and mink, hunt elk and deer, and sometimes guide hunting parties if they pay well enough. It is a solitary life, but it has always suited me." "Has always suited you," Magnolia repeated, catching the tense. "But perhaps not any more," he met her eyes. "Perhaps not any more," he agreed softly. "Or perhaps I am simply realizing that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing, and I have been calling one by the other's name for far too long. That is quite poetic for a mountain man. I read a lot of poetry during the long winters. Helps pass the time." She smiled. "What is your favorite?" "Lord Byron, I think, though I also have a fondness for Wordsworth." "I prefer Elizabeth Barrett Browning myself," Magnolia said, "though I also have a weakness for adventure novels. I have read every James Fenimore Cooper book I could get my hands on. The Last of the Mohicans, at least 3 times." They continued to talk as they moved together, the conversation flowing easily from books to favorite foods to childhood memories. Magnolia learned that Xavier had been born in Kentucky, but moved west with his father when he was 12, after his mother ran off with a traveling salesman. His father had been a hard man, not unkind but distant, and Xavier had learned early to be self-sufficient. He had been trapping on his own since he was 19, after his father died in a fall from a cliff face. In turn, Xavier learned about Magnolia's childhood, about her mother's slow decline from consumption, about the way her father had retreated into himself afterward, leaving Magnolia to essentially run the mercantile from the age of 14 onward. He learned about her love of numbers and bookkeeping, about how she sometimes dreamed of doing more than just working in a store but felt obligated to stay and help her father. "What would you do if you could do anything?" Xavier asked. Magnolia thought about it. "I think I would like to open a lending library. Nothing grand, just a small place where people could come and borrow books. There are so few books out here, and so many people hungry for reading material. I think it could be a real service to the community." "That sounds wonderful," Xavier said sincerely. "You should do it. Perhaps someday, when my father no longer needs me at the store. What if you could do both, Run the library out of the mercantile, she blinked, the idea catching her off guard. I had not thought of that. But it could work, could it not? We have space in the back room that is barely used. It would not take much to set up some shelves, organize a collection. You should speak to your father about it, Xavier encouraged. I think it is a fine idea, and I suspect many people in town would agree. The song ended, and once again, they stood together in the middle of the dance floor, reluctant to separate. But the evening was growing late, and people were beginning to gather their children and prepare to depart. Magnolia knew she should head home as well, should check on her father and make certain he had not worn himself out while she was gone. I should go, she said reluctantly. Let me walk you home, Xavier offered immediately. It is dark and the streets are uneven. That would be kind, thank you. They collected their coats and said their goodbyes to various townspeople, enduring knowing looks and whispered comments with as much grace as they could muster. Sarah caught Magnolia's hand as they were leaving and squeezed it tightly. I am so happy for you, she whispered. He is a good man, Magnolia. Anyone can see that. We only dance together, Sarah. Do not plan a wedding just yet. 2 dances, Sarah corrected with a grin. And the way he looks at you, that is not nothing, my dear friend. That is definitely something. The walk back to the mercantile took less than 10 minutes, but Magnolia wished it could last forever. The night air was cool and clear, filled with the scent of sage and dust, and the stars overhead seemed close enough to touch. Xavier walked beside her, matching his long strides to her shorter ones, occasionally pointing out constellations or telling her stories about navigating by the stars when he was deep in the wilderness. Too soon, they arrived at the mercantile. The building was dark except for a single lamp burning in the upstairs window where Magnolia and her father kept their living quarters. Thank you for walking me home, Magnolia said, turning to face Xavier on the wooden sidewalk. And thank you for tonight. For being willing to dance with me, even though we were both terrible at it. You made what could have been a miserable evening into something I will treasure. I should be thanking you, Xavier said. I have not enjoyed an evening that much in longer than I can remember. Magnolia, I know I live far away, and I know my life is not easy or comfortable, but I would very much like to see you again. To court you properly if you would be willing. Her heart soared. I would be very willing. But Xavier, you must know that I cannot simply leave my father and the store. At least not immediately. He depends on me. I understand. And I am not asking you to leave anything. I can come to town more frequently, perhaps once every 2 weeks instead of once a month. And perhaps sometimes you could visit my cabin, see what my life is like, decide if it is something you could ever imagine for yourself. He reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingertips grazing her cheek. I am not asking for promises or commitments tonight. I am simply asking for the chance to know you better, to spend time with you, to see where this leads. Yes, Magnolia breathed. Yes to all of that. He smiled, that transformative expression that made her stomach flip. Then, with careful deliberation, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. It was chaste, appropriate, but it sent warmth flooding through her entire body. Good night, Magnolia Thorne, he murmured against her skin. Good night, Xavier Garrett. She watched him walk away into the darkness, his tall form gradually disappearing into the shadows. Only when he was completely out of sight did she finally turn and enter the mercantile, climbing the stairs to the living quarters with a lightness in her step that had not been there in years. Her father was sitting in his chair by the window, clearly waiting up for her despite the late hour. He looked up as she entered, his tired face creasing into a smile. You look happy, he observed. I am, Magnolia admitted, unable to suppress her grin. Father, I danced tonight. Well, I attempted to dance. It was more like organized stumbling, but it was wonderful. "I am glad," Marcus said softly. "Your mother would have been glad too. Tell me about it." So Magnolia told him everything, from her awkward conversations with potential suitors to Sarah's matchmaking attempts to Xavier's unexpected arrival, and his even more unexpected offer to dance with her, despite neither of them knowing how. She told him about their conversations, about the books they both loved, about Xavier's invitation to court her properly. Marcus listened to it all with a small smile on his face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the dark street below. "This Xavier Garrett," he said finally. "He is a good man." "I believe he is, Father. He is kind and honest and hardworking. He lives a rough life in the mountains, trapping and hunting, but he is educated and thoughtful, and he makes me feel seen in a way I have not felt in a very long time." "Then I am happy for you, daughter. You deserve happiness. You have sacrificed so much to help me these past years, and I have taken advantage of your loyalty and good nature far longer than I should have." His voice was heavy with regret. "If this man can give you the life you deserve, then you have my blessing to pursue it, wherever it may lead." "Father, I am not going anywhere," Magnolia said firmly, going to kneel beside his chair. "Xavier understands that I have responsibilities here. We will find a way to make this work." But even as she said the words, she wondered how that would be possible. Xavier lived 15 miles away in the mountains, and she was tied to the mercantile by duty and love for her father. How could they build a future together when their lives were so fundamentally incompatible? She pushed the worry aside for now. Tonight had been magical, and she would not let fear spoil it. There would be time enough to figure out the practicalities later. Xavier was true to his word. 2 weeks after the dance social, he appeared at the mercantile with an almost shy expression on his face and a bunch of wildflowers in his hand. "I thought you might like these," he said, offering them to Magnolia. "They grow near my cabin. I picked them this morning." The flowers were beautiful, a riot of purple and yellow and white, still dewy from the mountain air. Magnolia took them with hands that trembled slightly. "They are lovely," she said softly. "Thank you. I also brought you something else." He pulled a slim volume from his saddlebag. "It is a collection of Byron's poetry. I thought, since you said you prefer Browning, perhaps you might like to read some of my favorites and we could discuss them." Magnolia took the book reverently. It was well worn, the pages soft from repeated reading, with notes penciled in the margins in Xavier's neat handwriting. The fact that he was sharing something so personal, so clearly treasured, made her eyes prick with unexpected tears. "I will read it cover to cover," she promised. "And then we can discuss which poems we prefer and why." "I would like that very much." Over the next several months, Xavier made good on his promise to visit more frequently. He came to town every 2 weeks, sometimes more often, always with some excuse about needing supplies or having business with the blacksmith or the trading post operator. But everyone in Green River knew the real reason was Magnolia Thorne. They spent as much time together as propriety and Magnolia's work would allow. Sometimes Xavier would help her in the mercantile, his strength making light work of moving heavy barrels and crates. Other times they would take walks together through the dusty streets of Green River or along the banks of the river the town was named for, talking about everything and nothing. Xavier told her stories about his life in the mountains, about tracking a wounded grizzly through a blizzard and barely escaping with his life, about finding hot springs hidden in remote valleys, about the eerie beauty of watching the northern lights dance across the winter sky. In turn, Magnolia shared her dreams and fears, her frustrations with the limited options available to women in the West, her guilt about wanting more than the life her father had built for them. Xavier listened to all of it without judgment, offering support and encouragement when she needed it, comfortable silence when she did not. They also worked together to realize Magnolia's dream of opening a lending library. Xavier helped clear out the back room of the mercantile, building sturdy shelves from lumber he hauled down from the mountains. Magnolia used some of her carefully saved money to order books from Denver and San Francisco, and she put up notices around town announcing that anyone could borrow books for a small fee that would go toward purchasing more volumes. The response was overwhelming. Women who were starved for reading material came in droves, delighted to have access to novels and poetry and histories. Even some of the men began stopping by, sheepishly admitting they enjoyed a good story. Within a month, the lending library had become an integral part of Green River's community, and Magnolia found herself busier than ever, managing both the mercantile and the growing collection of books. Her father, for his part, seemed revitalized by the new energy in the store. He began taking a more active role in the daily operations again, chatting with customers and managing the accounts, which freed up more of Magnolia's time to spend with Xavier. As autumn deepened into winter, Xavier began pressing Magnolia to visit his cabin in the mountains. "I want you to see where I live," he told her one cold December afternoon as they stood together in the mercantile, ostensibly organizing inventory, but mostly just looking for excuses to be near each other. "I want you to understand what my life is like up there, so you can decide if it is something you could ever want for yourself." "Xavier, we have talked about this," Magnolia said gently. "I cannot simply abandon my father and the store to go gallivanting off to your cabin. Not gallivanting. Visiting. For a day or two. Your father has hired that young man, Thomas, to help with the heavy work, and the lending library practically runs itself now. Surely you could take a brief trip." His gray eyes were intense, almost pleading. "Magnolia, we have been courting for nearly 4 months now, and I am falling in love with you. But I need you to see my world, to experience it, before we can talk about any kind of future together." Her breath caught at his words. "You are falling in love with me. I thought that was obvious." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused thumb stroking over her knuckles. "I love you, Magnolia Thorne. I think I have been falling in love with you since that night at the dance social when we made complete fools of ourselves and did not care. You are brave and strong and capable, and you make me want to be a better man. You make me want to build a life that has room for more than just solitude and survival." Tears spilled down Magnolia's cheeks. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been so afraid to say it, afraid that loving you meant choosing between you and my father, between you and the life I have built here. But Xavier, I do love you. You make me feel alive and valued and seen. You make me feel like I am enough exactly as I am." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his broad chest. She could hear his heart beating, steady and strong, and she let herself sink into the embrace, feeling safe and cherished and home. "Come to the cabin," he murmured into her hair. "Just for 2 days. Let me show you my world. And then we will figure out together how to build a life that works for both of us, that honors your obligations to your father while also giving us a chance at happiness together." "All right," she agreed, pulling back to look up at him. "After Christmas. I will come visit your cabin after Christmas, and we will see if a shopkeeper's daughter from Green River can survive in a mountain man's world." He grinned. "You will do more than survive, Magnolia. I have no doubt of that." Christmas came and went, celebrated quietly with her father and a few close friends. Xavier gave Magnolia a beautiful fur cloak he had made himself from beaver pelts, soft and warm and expertly stitched. She gave him a new set of books she had ordered specially from a catalog, including a collection of Walt Whitman poetry and a novel by Charles Dickens he had mentioned wanting to read. On the day after Christmas, as dawn broke cold and clear over Green River, Magnolia packed a small bag and met Xavier at the edge of town. He had brought a gentle mare for her to ride, and they set out together into the mountains, following narrow trails that wound through pine forests and across frozen streams. The journey took most of the day. As they climbed higher, the temperature dropped and the snow grew deeper, but Xavier guided them expertly, clearly familiar with every twist and turn of the terrain. He pointed out animal tracks in the snow, taught her to recognize the signs of a nearby predator, showed her how to read the landscape for sources of water and shelter. By late afternoon, they arrived at Xavier's cabin. It was small but solid, built from hand-hewn logs and situated in a clearing that offered stunning views of the surrounding peaks. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Magnolia realized Xavier must have left a fire banked before coming to town. "It is not much," Xavier said, suddenly sounding uncertain. "I know it is rough compared to what you are used to." Magnolia dismounted and looked around with genuine appreciation. The cabin might be simple, but it was well maintained and thoughtfully designed. There was a small porch with a bench, perfect for sitting and enjoying the view. A lean-to beside the cabin housed firewood stacked neatly to the roof. The whole place had an air of comfortable self-sufficiency. "It is wonderful," she said honestly. "I can see why you love it here." Relief flooded Xavier's face. He helped her inside, carrying her bag and setting it near the door. The interior was a single large room with a fireplace at one end, a sturdy bed at the other, and a rough table with 2 chairs in the middle. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books and supplies, and furs and animal hides hung from pegs driven into the logs. It smelled of wood smoke and leather and pine, a scent that was distinctly Xavier. "I will sleep on the floor," Xavier said quickly, gesturing to the bed. "You take the bed. I have plenty of furs to keep me warm." "Xavier, I trust you," Magnolia said quietly. "We do not need to be ridiculous about the sleeping arrangements. The bed is certainly large enough for both of us, and I would rather you be comfortable in your own home." He looked torn between propriety and practicality. Finally, he nodded. "We will see how we both feel about it when evening comes. For now, let me show you around and teach you some of what I do up here." The next day and a half passed in a blur of new experiences. Xavier taught Magnolia how to check his trap lines, how to skin a rabbit, how to read the weather by watching the behavior of birds and the color of the sky. They cooked simple meals together over the fire, and Magnolia discovered she was better at outdoor cooking than she had ever been at managing a proper stove. They talked for hours, sitting by the fire or walking through the snow-covered forest, sharing their deepest hopes and fears. At night, they did indeed share the bed, lying together fully clothed beneath layers of furs and blankets, holding each other for warmth and comfort but nothing more. It was intimate and innocent all at once, and Magnolia felt closer to Xavier than she had ever felt to another human being. On the second evening, as they sat together watching the sun set over the mountains in a blaze of orange and pink, Xavier took Magnolia's hand. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. "Could you be happy here, at least for part of the year?" Magnolia considered carefully before answering. "I think I could," she said slowly. "But Xavier, I cannot abandon my father completely. He needs me and I feel responsible for him. I know, and I would never ask you to abandon him." Xavier turned to face her fully. "But what if we could find a compromise? What if we spent the trapping season up here, just the 2 of us, and then came down to Green River for the rest of the year? I could find work as a guide or a freighter, help you with the mercantile and the library. Your father could hire more help to ease his burden. It would not be easy, but I think we could make it work. You would be willing to give up your solitude, to split your time between here and town. For you, yes. Magnolia, I want a life with you more than I want anything else. If that means compromising, adapting, building something new that neither of us has done before, then so be it. He reached up and cupped her face in his large, calloused hand. I want to marry you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. I want to build a future together, whatever shape that future takes. Magnolia's heart felt like it might burst from her chest. Yes, she breathed. Yes, Xavier, I want all of that too. I want to marry you and build a life together and figure out how to make it all work. He kissed her then, their first real kiss, and it was everything Magnolia had dreamed a kiss could be. It was gentle and passionate, tender and fierce, full of promise and hope and love. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. I do not have a ring to offer you, he said softly, but I will get you one, I promise, the finest I can afford. I do not need a ring, Magnolia assured him. I just need you. They returned to Green River the next day, and the news of their engagement spread through town like wildfire. Sarah was beside herself with joy, immediately beginning to plan a wedding celebration. Marcus Thorne wept when Magnolia told him, but they were tears of happiness mixed with relief. I have been so worried about what would become of you after I am gone, he admitted. Knowing that you will have a good man to care for you, that you will have a life and a future, lifts a weight from my heart that I have carried for far too long. You are not going anywhere for a long time yet, Father, Magnolia said firmly. And even when Xavier and I are married, I will not abandon you. We have it all planned out. We will spend the winters in the mountains, but the rest of the year we will be here in Green River, helping with the store and the library. You do not have to do that for me, daughter. I can hire help. I know I do not have to, but I want to. This is my home too, and I am not ready to give it up completely. Besides, Xavier has agreed that splitting our time between the mountains and town will give us the best of both worlds. Marcus looked at her with such pride and love that Magnolia felt tears prick her eyes again. When did you become so wise? He asked. I learned from you, Father. You taught me to work hard, to value responsibility, to honor my commitments. But you also taught me, even if you did not mean to, that sacrificing everything for duty can lead to a lonely life. I am determined to find balance, to honor my obligations while also pursuing my own happiness. The wedding was set for early March, giving them time to plan and prepare. In the meantime, Xavier continued his regular visits to town, and the relationship between him and Marcus grew stronger. The older man clearly appreciated Xavier's strength and steadiness, and Xavier in turn showed genuine respect and affection for his future father-in-law. As March approached, Magnolia found herself growing increasingly excited and nervous. She and Sarah spent hours sewing her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory cotton with delicate blue embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Xavier commissioned a ring from the blacksmith, a gold band engraved with tiny pine trees, a permanent reminder of their time in the mountains together. The wedding day arrived with bright sunshine and unseasonably warm weather. The ceremony was held in the new schoolhouse where they had danced that first night, and it seemed fitting to Magnolia that they should begin their married life in the place where their love story had really started. Magnolia walked down the makeshift aisle on her father's arm, her heart pounding with joy and anticipation. Xavier stood at the front of the room, looking almost unbearably handsome in a new suit, his long hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. When his eyes met hers, she saw her own happiness reflected back at her, amplified 1,000-fold. The ceremony itself was simple and brief, officiated by the circuit preacher who had announced the dance social all those months ago. They exchanged vows and rings, and when Xavier kissed his new bride, the assembled townspeople erupted into applause and cheers. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and more food than anyone could possibly eat. This time, when Xavier and Magnolia took to the dance floor, they were slightly less terrible at waltzing, though still far from graceful. But they did not care, and neither did anyone else. They moved together with the ease of two people who knew each other deeply, who had learned to find their own rhythm regardless of what anyone else thought or expected. "Mrs. Garrett," Xavier murmured against her ear as they swayed together. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Magnolia agreed, smiling up at him. "So do I, husband." They spent their first week of marriage in Xavier's cabin in the mountains, a blissful honeymoon away from the prying eyes and constant demands of town life. Magnolia discovered that being married to Xavier was everything she had hoped and more. He was gentle and patient, passionate and attentive, and he treated her like the most precious thing in his world. When they returned to Green River, they settled into the rhythm they had discussed, living in the small apartment above the mercantile and working together to run the store and the lending library. Marcus's health improved with the reduction in his workload, and he seemed younger, more energetic than he had in years. Thomas, the young man Marcus had hired to help with the heavy work, proved to be reliable and hardworking, which allowed both Marcus and Magnolia more freedom. As summer turned to autumn, Xavier began preparing for the trapping season. He restocked his supplies, repaired his traps, and made improvements to the cabin in anticipation of Magnolia spending the winter there with him. The plan was for them to head to the mountains in early November and return to Green River in April, a pattern they would follow each year. Magnolia found herself both excited and nervous about spending months in the isolated cabin. But Xavier's confidence and careful preparations helped ease her worries. He taught her additional survival skills, ensured she had appropriate clothing for the harsh mountain winters, and stocked the cabin with enough books and supplies to keep them comfortable through the coldest months. They left for the mountains on a crisp November morning, both of them riding horses laden with supplies. Marcus stood outside the mercantile to see them off, and Magnolia hugged him tightly, promising to return in the spring healthy and happy. "Take care of each other," Marcus said, clasping Xavier's hand firmly. "And son, thank you for making my daughter happier than I have seen her since her mother died." "It is my privilege and honor, sir," Xavier replied solemnly. The winter in the mountains was challenging but magical. Magnolia learned to navigate the deep snow, to recognize the signs of an approaching storm, to help Xavier with his trap lines and the processing of furs. She also discovered a talent for preserving meat and making medicines from the herbs and roots Xavier showed her how to identify. The long evenings by the fire became her favorite time. They would cook together, then sit close for warmth while reading aloud from their collection of books or simply talking about their dreams for the future. Sometimes they would make love, learning each other's bodies and hearts with patient tenderness. Other times they would simply hold each other, content in the comfortable silence that comes when two people are completely at ease together. It was during one of those quiet evenings in February, with snow falling thick and fast outside, that Magnolia realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but now she was certain. The thought filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. "Xavier," she said, setting down the shirt she had been mending, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the trap he was repairing, immediately attentive. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine. More than fine. Xavier, I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, he simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then a smile broke across his face, so wide and joyful that Magnolia felt her own eyes fill with tears. "A baby," he breathed, setting aside the trap and crossing to her in 2 long strides. He knelt beside her chair and placed his large hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Magnolia, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor." "But Xavier, all the signs are there. I think the baby will come in late summer or early autumn." He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she had suddenly become fragile. "This is the best news," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I would have a family of my own, never imagined I could be this happy. Thank you, Magnolia. Thank you for giving me everything I never knew I needed." They spent the rest of the winter planning and dreaming about their child. Xavier began work on a cradle, carving it from pine with meticulous care, decorating it with images of mountains and trees and animals. Magnolia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, marveling at how small everything was, how fragile. When they returned to Green River in April, Magnolia's pregnancy was just beginning to show. Marcus was overjoyed at the news, immediately insisting that Magnolia take it easy and let him handle more of the store's operations. Sarah and the other women in town immediately took Magnolia under their collective wing, offering advice and hand-me-down baby items and endless stories about childbirth and motherhood. The summer passed in a blur of preparation. Xavier found regular work as a guide for hunting parties and freighters hauling goods through the mountains, which provided a steady income to supplement what the mercantile and fur trapping brought in. He was rarely gone for more than a few days at a time, always anxious to return to Magnolia and make certain she and the baby were well. In early September, as the first hints of autumn touched the air, Magnolia went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting through an entire day and night, but Xavier never left her side. He held her hand, wiped her brow, encouraged her when she was certain she could not go on. And when their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry, Xavier wept openly, cradling the tiny, wrinkled infant with hands that were infinitely gentle. "He is perfect," Xavier breathed, staring down at his son with wonder. "Magnolia, he is absolutely perfect." "We should name him Marcus," Magnolia said softly, watching her husband fall in love with their child. "After my father." Xavier looked up at her, his gray eyes shining. "Marcus Garrett, I like that very much." Little Marcus was a healthy, happy baby who seemed to take the disruptions of his parents' unconventional lifestyle in stride. When he was 2 months old, the family headed to the mountains for the trapping season, and the baby thrived in the cabin just as his parents did. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, always willing to walk the floor with a fussy infant or change soiled clothes without complaint. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and celebrations. 2 years after Marcus was born, Magnolia delivered twin girls, Emma and Rose, who had their father's gray eyes and their mother's auburn hair. 3 years after that came another son, Samuel, who proved to be as adventurous and bold as his older brother was thoughtful and quiet. The family split their time between the mountains and Green River, and the children grew up equally comfortable in both worlds. They learned to trap and hunt and track in the wilderness with their father, and to read and calculate and interact with people in town with their mother. They were unusual children, neither fully mountain folk nor fully town residents, but they were happy and healthy and deeply loved. Marcus Thorne lived to see all 4 of his grandchildren born, and he passed away peacefully in his sleep when little Samuel was 2 years old. His death was a blow, but Magnolia took comfort in knowing he had spent his final years happy, surrounded by family, watching his daughter build the life he had always wanted for her. After Marcus's death, Magnolia and Xavier made the decision to stay in Green River year-round rather than continue their winter migrations to the mountains. The children were getting older and needed more consistent schooling, and Xavier's guiding business had grown successful enough that he no longer needed to trap to make ends meet. They kept the mountain cabin as a retreat, a place the family could escape to for a few weeks each summer, but their primary home became the apartment above the Mercantile, which they expanded to accommodate their growing family. The lending library continued to flourish, eventually growing so large that it needed its own building. Magnolia oversaw the construction of a small library adjacent to the Mercantile, funded by donations from the community and her own careful savings. It became a gathering place for the town, a center of learning and culture in a rough and often harsh landscape. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Magnolia with a special gift. He had commissioned a local artist to create a painting of them dancing at the social all those years ago, capturing the moment when 2 awkward people who did not know the steps had held each other close and moved together anyway. "I want our children to know this story," Xavier told her as they stood together looking at the painting. "I want them to understand that love does not require perfection or grace. It just requires 2 people willing to be brave enough to be foolish together, to hold on to each other even when they do not know what they are doing." Magnolia leaned into her husband's solid warmth, marveling at the life they had built together. From that first night when a mountain man had offered his hand to a woman who could not dance, they had created something beautiful and lasting. They had found their own rhythm, their own way of moving through the world, and it had been more than enough. "I love you," she whispered, the words as true as they had been the first time she said them. "Thank you for teaching me to dance." Xavier kissed the top of her head, his arms encircling her waist. "You taught me, Magnolia. You taught me that life is not meant to be lived alone, that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing, that the bravest thing a person can do is open their heart and take a chance on love. Everything good in my life started the night I walked into that dance social and saw you hiding in the corner, looking like you wanted to run away. Everything good in my life started when you offered to look ridiculous with me," she countered, smiling up at him. They stood together for a long time, holding each other in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had learned each other's hearts completely. Outside, their children played in the street, their laughter ringing through the evening air. The Mercantile and library stood solid and successful, monuments to hard work and determination. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and majestic in the fading light, a reminder of where they had begun and where they always could return. Years later, when Magnolia was old and gray and surrounded by grandchildren, she would tell the story of the night she learned to dance. She would describe Xavier's uncertainty and kindness, the way they had stumbled through that first waltz with more enthusiasm than skill, how the townspeople had stared and whispered, but how neither of them had cared. She would tell how that single evening had changed the entire course of her life, how one act of brave foolishness had led to a lifetime of love and happiness. And she would always end the story the same way, with the words that had become the family motto, the principle that guided the Garrett children and grandchildren through their own lives and loves. When you find someone who is willing to hold you close and move with you anyway, even when neither of you knows the steps, That is when you have found something worth keeping. That is when you have found home. Xavier lived to the remarkable age of 78, still strong and vital until the very end. He passed away in the mountain cabin he had built with his own hands, surrounded by Magnolia and their children and grandchildren, having lived a life far richer and fuller than the lonely boy who had grown up in the wilderness ever could have imagined. Magnolia followed him 3 years later, having spent her final years overseeing the library that bore her name and telling stories to great-grandchildren who sat at her feet with rapt attention. She died peacefully in her sleep, and those who found her said she was smiling, as if in her dreams she was once again a young woman of 22, being held close by a mountain man who had never learned to dance, but who loved her with a devotion that spanned decades. Their children inherited both the mercantile and the mountain cabin, maintaining the traditions their parents had established. The painting of that first dance hung in the library for generations, a reminder to everyone in Green River that the most beautiful love stories often begin with two imperfect people willing to be brave together, willing to stumble and laugh and hold each other close while they figure out the steps. The town of Green River grew and changed over the years, but the story of Magnolia Thorne and Xavier Garrett remained, passed down through families, told to children and grandchildren as an example of what true love looked like. It was not perfect or graceful. It was not easy or without challenges. But it was real and lasting and built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared laughter, and the willingness to be vulnerable with another human being. On the wall of the library, beneath the painting of that first dance, someone eventually added a small brass plaque. It read simply, "She was the one who never learned to dance. They noticed. Mountain Man held her close and moved with her anyway. From such small acts of courage and kindness, great loves are born." And so the story ended, as all good stories must, with love triumphant and a legacy that would endure long after the original participants had passed into memory. Magnolia and Xavier had built something extraordinary from the most ordinary of beginnings, proving that sometimes the most transformative moments in life come not from grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but from simple acts of human connection, from choosing to be vulnerable, from offering a hand to someone who looks lost and saying, "Let us be foolish together. Let us hold each other close and move together anyway, even if we do not know the steps. Let us be brave enough to try." Their great-great-grandchildren still visit the mountain cabin every summer, still walk the streets of Green River where their ancestors built a life together. They still tell the story of that first dance, that moment when everything changed, when a woman who could not dance and a man who lived alone in the wilderness found each other and decided to build something neither had imagined possible. The mercantile eventually became a historical landmark, the lending library a cornerstone of the community. But more than buildings or businesses, what Magnolia and Xavier left behind was a legacy of love that refused to be constrained by convention or circumstance. They taught their children and grandchildren that happiness is not found in perfection but in connection, not in always knowing the right steps, but in being willing to figure them out together. And on warm summer evenings in Green River, Wyoming, when the sun sets over the mountains in blazes of orange and pink, if you listen carefully, some say you can almost hear the distant strains of a waltz, played imperfectly but with great enthusiasm, and the sound of laughter from two people who never quite learned to dance properly, but who moved through life together with grace born not of skill, but of profound and enduring love.